The hangar fell silent except for the rhythmic ping of cooling metal. Lieutenant Commander Katia Wrench Volkov stood beside the gutted remains of an FA-18E Super Hornet, her oil-stained flight suit telling the story of 3 sleepless nights. The engine bay gaped open like a wound, revealing twisted titanium and severed fuel lines that had claimed 2 previous repair attempts. Above them, the October sky over Naval Air Station Oceana pressed gray and heavy, matching the mood of every mechanic who declared the aircraft beyond salvation. "If you fix this engine, I'll eat my stripes," laughed Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, slapping his knee as he gestured toward the ancient civilian janitor hunched over a mop bucket in the corner. The old man's weathered hands gripped the handle with surprising steadiness, his pale blue eyes studying the aircraft with an intensity that seemed out of place for someone paid to empty trash cans. His name tag read simply Walter, no rank, no credentials, just a ghost who'd haunted these hangars for 15 years without anyone questioning his presence. Katia felt heat rise in her cheeks. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 commendations for excellence in aerial combat, and still they treated her like the squadron mascot. The engine failure had happened during her watch, her pre-flight inspection, her responsibility. Now Rodriguez was making jokes while her career hung in the balance like a broken wing. "Maybe we should listen to him," she said quietly, surprising herself. Something in Walter's posture reminded her of her grandfather, a man who could resurrect dead tractors with intuition and spare parts. The old janitor looked up at her words, and for a moment she saw not the stooped maintenance worker but someone else entirely, someone whose eyes held decades of unspoken knowledge. Rodriguez's laughter died. "You're serious? Lady, that's a $70 million piece of American engineering, not some crop duster from the 50s. He gestured dismissively toward Walter. "This fossil probably learned engines when they still used propellers." The insult hung in the recycled air like jet fuel vapor. Walter straightened slowly, his movements deliberate rather than frail. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd learned when words mattered and when they didn't. "Might be I know a thing or two about keeping birds in the sky," he said, setting down his mop with ceremonial precision. "Question is whether you're interested in solutions, or just looking for someone to blame when this one never flies again." The challenge settled over them like morning fog. Katia studied the impossible tangle of destroyed components, then looked back at Walter. Behind his weathered features, she glimpsed something that made her pulse quicken, the unmistakable confidence of someone who'd faced impossible odds before and found a way through. Rodriguez crossed his arms, his stripes catching the fluorescent light. "You're both out of your minds." But Katia was already reaching for her toolbox. The maintenance bay buzzed with the low hum of industrial fans and whispered conversations as word spread through the squadron. "Wrench is letting the janitor work on her bird." The story grew with each telling, becoming more absurd, more impossible. Lieutenant Commander Katia Volkov had built her reputation on precision and competence, not desperate gambles with custodial staff. Walter worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. He'd removed his janitor's jacket, revealing forearms mapped with old burns and newer scars. His hands moved through the engine compartment like a pianist finding familiar keys, pausing at connections that 3 certified mechanics had declared hopeless. Katia knelt beside him, playing assistant to a man whose credentials existed only in the graveyard of her intuition. "Fuel distribution manifolds cracked clean through," Walter murmured, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise. "But that's not your real problem." He pointed to a sensor cluster buried deep in the engine bay. "See how the wiring harness sits? Someone forced the connection during the last overhaul. Been sending false readings for months." The observation hit Katia like a physical blow. She'd been chasing phantom problems, replacing components that were never broken while the real culprit hid in plain sight. "How did you see that?" Walter's smile carried no smugness, only the weary satisfaction of someone who'd spent a lifetime translating machine language into human understanding. Same way you spot trouble in the sky. You listen to what the bird's trying to tell you. Behind them, Rodriguez paced like a caged animal. The chief had made his declaration in front of half the squadron, and naval hierarchies weren't known for forgiving public humiliation. But as Walter continued his methodical diagnosis, identifying problems that had eluded certified professionals, Rodriguez's skepticism began shifting toward something more dangerous, the fear of being proven wrong. "Even if you're right about the diagnostics," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "you still need parts. That manifold is custom manufactured. 6-week lead time minimum, and that's if procurement doesn't lose the paperwork." He gestured toward the engine bay like it was evidence in a court-martial. "This bird's grounded until Christmas, and that's being optimistic." Walter didn't look up from his work. "Might be we can fabricate something." He traced the crack with one finger, measuring angles and stress points with nothing but touch and experience. "Got a machine shop in town that specializes in impossible repairs. Owner's an old friend." The casual mention of resources outside the official supply chain sent a chill through the hangar. Military maintenance operated within strict protocols and documented procedures. What Walter was suggesting lived in the gray area between resourcefulness and insubordination. Katia found herself at a crossroads that had nothing to do with engine repair and everything to do with trust. The machine shop squatted between a tire store and a defunct auto parts warehouse, its corrugated metal siding stained with decades of industrial grime. Katia followed Walter through a door that opened onto controlled chaos. Lathes and milling machines crowded together like mechanical sculptures, their surfaces gleaming with fresh oil and purpose. The smell of cutting fluid and hot metal filled her nostrils, familiar and comforting in ways that surprised her. Mickey's worked on everything from NASCAR engines to space shuttle components, Walter explained as they navigated between workbenches cluttered with precision instruments. "If it moves and breaks, he can fix it. If it doesn't exist, he can make it." The man who emerged from behind a computerized milling machine looked nothing like Katia's imagination of a miracle worker. Mickey Chen stood barely 5'6", his slight frame overwhelmed by grease-stained coveralls. His hands were surgeon-precise as he examined the cracked manifold Walter had somehow extracted from the Super Hornet without triggering a single safety protocol. "Military contract?" Mickey asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned when not to ask questions. "Personal favor," Walter replied, "for someone who needs to fly." The distinction mattered in ways Katia was only beginning to understand. Official channels meant requisitions and approval signatures, documentation trails that could take weeks to navigate. Personal favors operated in the spaces between regulations, powered by relationships that predated bureaucracy. Mickey held the damaged component up to the light, examining the stress fractures with the focused intensity of a jeweler studying a diamond. Titanium alloy, precision tolerances, not exactly garage shop material. He set the part down gently, his expression thoughtful. "But not impossible either. Give me 6 hours and I'll have something that'll hold together long enough to matter." 6 hours. Katia felt the timeline compress around her like G-force during a hard turn. The squadron's readiness assessment was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and showing up one aircraft short would trigger questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Rodriguez had already begun documenting the failure in terms that would make her look either incompetent or insubordinate. "What's the catch?" she asked, because experience had taught her that miracles always carried a price. Mickey exchanged a look with Walter, some communication passing between them that existed entirely outside of words. "No catch," he said finally, "just understanding that some debts can't be paid in money." As Walter drove them back toward the base, Katia stared out at the industrial landscape rolling past, and wondered what kind of debt she was accumulating. The hangar had emptied by the time they returned, leaving only the security lights and the persistent hum of climate control systems. Walter worked with the focused precision of a surgeon fitting Mickey's fabricated manifold into the engine bay, while Katia held lights and handed tools like an operating room nurse. The replacement part looked identical to the original, but she could feel the difference in its weight, slightly heavier, denser, as if Mickey had engineered extra strength into every molecule. He used different alloy specifications, Walter explained as he torqued the mounting bolts to precise specifications. Military contractors optimize for cost. Mickey optimizes for survival. The distinction seemed to summarize everything Katia had learned about the space between official procedure and actual results. The Navy taught her to follow protocols because protocols prevented disasters. But protocols also assumed that every problem had an authorized solution, that every crisis could be resolved through proper channels and documented procedures. Walter's approach operated on different principles entirely. He diagnosed problems through intuition seasoned by decades of experience, then solved them using whatever resources were available. It was simultaneously more dangerous and more effective than anything she'd learned in flight school. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they reconnected the final sensor clusters. The question had been building in her mind since Rodriguez's challenge, growing heavier with each hour Walter spent working without explanation or reward. He paused in his work, his weathered hands still gripping a wrench. When he looked at her, she saw past the janitor's uniform to something else entirely, a depth of knowledge that belonged in a different decade, a different war. "Because someone helped me once," he said quietly, "when I needed to fly again." The simple statement carried weight that transformed the entire evening. Walter wasn't just a maintenance worker with unusual skills. He was someone who'd needed second chances, who understood the crushing weight of grounded aircraft and failed missions. Someone who'd learned that keeping birds in the sky sometimes required operating outside the margins of approved procedure. As they finished the repair, Katia realized she wasn't just fixing an engine. She was joining a tradition that predated her commission, her training, her understanding of how things were supposed to work. A tradition of people who did whatever was necessary to keep flying, regardless of what the regulations said about proper channels and authorized procedures. Tomorrow morning would bring the readiness assessment, Rodriguez's skepticism, and the test of whether Mickey's fabricated manifold could actually keep a $70 million aircraft in operational condition. But tonight, for the first time in 3 days, the engine bay looked complete. Dawn arrived gray and cold, carrying the smell of jet fuel and possibility. Katia arrived at the hangar early to find Rodriguez already there, his uniform crisp and his expression set in the careful neutrality of someone prepared to document failure. Behind him stood Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the squadron's operations officer, her presence adding official weight to what should have been routine engine testing. "Morning, wrench," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness of someone who'd spent the night preparing paperwork. "Ready to see if your pet janitor actually knows anything about modern aircraft." The dismissive tone should have stung, but Katia found herself oddly calm. She'd spent the early morning hours running system diagnostics, checking and rechecking every connection Walter had made. The engine responded to electronic queries with the steady reliability of a healthy turbofan, but ground testing was different from the brutal demands of actual flight. Walter appeared at the hangar's side entrance, pushing his mop bucket with the same unhurried precision he'd shown while rebuilding impossible components. To anyone watching casually, he looked exactly like what his uniform suggested, an aging civilian contractor paid to keep floors clean and wastebaskets empty. But Katia had learned to read the subtle signs that marked him as something else entirely. "Chief Rodriguez," Lieutenant Commander Chen said, consulting her tablet, "I understand we're testing some unconventional repair work." The phrasing was carefully neutral, but Katia heard the underlying tension. Word of Walter's involvement had traveled up the chain of command, raising questions about protocol compliance and maintenance certification. If the engine failed during testing, it wouldn't just be a mechanical problem. It would become an investigation into unauthorized procedures and civilian involvement in military aircraft maintenance. Rodriguez straightened, his stripes catching the fluorescent light. Lieutenant Commander Volkov authorized repairs by uncertified personnel. I documented my objections, but she chose to proceed without proper oversight. The accusation hung in the recycled air like cordite smoke. Katia felt the familiar weight of command decisions, the crushing responsibility of choices that could destroy careers along with aircraft. She'd gambled her reputation on an old man's intuition and a machine shop owner's skill, and now the bill was coming due. "Is that accurate, Lieutenant Commander?" Chen asked, her tone professionally neutral. Katia looked across the hangar at Walter, who continued mopping with methodical precision. His movements held no tension, no indication that he was listening to a conversation that could end his 15-year employment at the base. He worked like someone who'd faced similar moments before and learned that worry was less useful than preparation. "Yes, ma'am," Katia replied. "I authorized the repairs." The admission sealed her fate, regardless of how the engine performed. The Super Hornet's twin turbofans spun up with the characteristic whine of healthy machinery, their sound echoing through the hangar like mechanical thunder. Katia stood at the test console, monitoring engine parameters while Rodriguez and Lieutenant Commander Chen observed from what they clearly considered a safe distance. The initial readings looked perfect: oil pressure, fuel flow, exhaust gas temperature, all within normal operational ranges. But ground testing only revealed so much. The real test would come when 15 tons of aircraft demanded full military power from engines that had been rebuilt by an aging janitor, and a civilian machinist operating outside every approved procedure. "Looks good so far," Katia called over the engine noise, though she kept her voice carefully neutral. Rodriguez's prediction about eating his stripes had become squadron legend overnight, and she had no interest in premature celebration. Walter had positioned himself near the hangar's main entrance, his mop bucket forgotten as he watched the testing with the focused attention of someone who'd invested personal pride in the outcome. His weathered features revealed nothing, but Katia caught him checking his watch with the precise timing of someone who understood mechanical stress and thermal cycling. "Temperature spike on engine 2, she announced as the readings climbed toward yellow line limits. For a moment, the success of Mickey's fabricated manifold hung in the balance like an aircraft on final approach. Then the temperature stabilized, settling into the green zone with the steady reliability of factory-original equipment. Rodriguez's expression shifted from skeptical anticipation to something approaching disappointment. He'd built his authority on technical expertise and regulatory compliance, and Walter's success threatened assumptions that had shaped 15 years of military maintenance experience. "Run her up to full military power," Lieutenant Commander Chen ordered, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd made peace with calculated risks. Katia's hands moved across the throttle controls with practiced precision, pushing both engines toward maximum non-afterburning thrust. The Super Hornet strained against the tie-down chains like a living thing desperate to return to its natural element. Engine temperatures climbed into ranges that would have terrified her 3 days ago, but Mickey's modified manifold handled the stress load without complaint. "All parameters normal," she reported, unable to keep satisfaction from creeping into her voice. "Engines performing within specifications." Across the hangar, Walter allowed himself a small smile. He'd staked his reputation on intuition and experience, gambling that decades of keeping broken things flying had taught him something that certified technicians had never learned. The test continued for 20 minutes, pushing the rebuilt engines through every operational scenario except actual flight. When Chen finally ordered shutdown, the silence felt profound. The flight line stretched endlessly under October's pale sun, aircraft arranged in precise rows like metallic monuments to American air power. Katia completed her pre-flight inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments, but her attention kept drifting to the engines Walter had rebuilt with nothing but intuition and borrowed expertise. Tower Ocean Aground, Super Hornet ready for taxi. Ocean Aground, Tower, taxi to runway 05, hold short. The familiar radio chatter grounded her in procedure and protocol, the structured communication that transformed individual aircraft into coordinated elements of military precision. But as she guided the Super Hornet toward the active runway, Katia carried knowledge that existed outside official channels. The understanding that her aircraft flew on components fabricated in an unmarked machine shop by a man who'd learned precision from necessity rather than regulation. Rodriguez stood beside the control tower, his binoculars trained on her aircraft with the focused intensity of someone whose career depended on mechanical failure. He'd spent the morning documenting every irregularity in Walter's repair procedures, building a case that would survive whatever happened during the test flight. His stripes might be forfeit, but he could still salvage professional credibility by proving that unauthorized maintenance was fundamentally dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Chen occupied the tower's observation deck, her presence transforming routine flight testing into official evaluation. The morning's ground testing had proven that Walter's repairs could handle static loads and controlled power settings, but flight testing would subject every component to the dynamic stresses that separated theoretical engineering from practical survival. Tower, Super Hornet ready for takeoff. Super Hornet Tower, wind 040 at 15, runway 05 cleared for takeoff. Katia advanced the throttles to military power, feeling Mickey's fabricated manifold channel 16,000 pounds of thrust per engine into forward motion. The aircraft accelerated with familiar urgency, pressing her back into the ejection seat as aerodynamic forces transformed dead weight into lifting force. At 140 knots, she pulled back on the stick, and the Super Hornet clawed its way into Virginia's autumn sky. The climb felt different somehow, as if the aircraft appreciated being airborne again after 3 days of hangar-bound frustration. Katia leveled off at 5,000 feet and began the systematic evaluation of every system Walter had touched, monitoring engine parameters while performing turns, climbs, and accelerations that would reveal any weakness in the unauthorized repair work. Everything performed flawlessly. 20 minutes into the test flight, Katia found herself alone with the sky and the steady rhythm of perfectly synchronized turbofans. Below, the Virginia coastline spread out like a tactical map, familiar landmarks reduced to geometric abstractions. The radio crackled with routine traffic, other aircraft conducting their own missions, air traffic controllers managing the controlled chaos of military aviation, the endless conversation between earth and sky that had defined her adult life. Ocean Tower, Super Hornet, requesting permission for high-performance testing. Super Hornet Tower, approved for high-performance testing, remained clear of restricted airspace. She rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled through a barrel roll that subjected every structural component to loads approaching design limits. The engines responded without hesitation, their steady power output maintaining perfect synchronization through maneuvers that would have revealed any weakness in Walter's repair work. Mickey's fabricated manifold handled stress loads that exceeded anything the original component had been designed to survive. The success felt personal in ways that surprised her. Walter had gambled his reputation on her problem, investing expertise that belonged to a different era of aviation maintenance. His success validated not just technical skill, but an entire approach to solving impossible problems. The conviction that experience and intuition could triumph over regulation and documentation when aircraft needed to fly. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with barely controlled tension. "Super Hornet, what's your status on the high-performance testing?" The question carried subtext that had nothing to do with flight parameters and everything to do with professional survival. Rodriguez had built his authority on the principle that proper procedure prevented disasters, and Walter's success threatened the foundation of everything he taught younger mechanics about the relationship between regulation and safety. "All systems nominal," Katia replied, unable to resist adding emphasis to the word all. "Engines performing flawlessly." The admission traveled through radio waves to the control tower, where Lieutenant Commander Chen made notes that would become part of Katia's official record. But it also reached Walter, who stood in the hangar doorway tracking her aircraft's path across the sky with the satisfied expression of someone who'd kept another bird flying. As she completed the final series of test maneuvers, Katia realized that Walter's repair work had accomplished something more significant than fixing broken engines. He demonstrated that the space between regulation and results could be navigated by people who understood both mechanical systems and human necessity. The approach and landing felt routine, but Katia knew that nothing about the last 4 days had been routine. She'd gambled her career on an old man's promise, and Walter had delivered results that exceeded everything she'd hoped for. As the Super Hornet's wheels touched Virginia concrete, she carried knowledge that would transform her understanding of leadership, authority, and the difference between following procedures and solving problems. In the hangar, Rodriguez waited with his documentation and his wounded pride, but Walter had already returned to his mop bucket, disappearing back into the camouflage of civilian contractor uniforms and maintenance schedules that kept him invisible to casual observation. The post-flight debriefing should have been routine: engine parameters, system performance, maintenance recommendations filed in triplicate and forgotten by everyone, except the technicians who'd implement them during the next scheduled overhaul. Instead, Katia found herself facing Lieutenant Commander Chen across a conference table that felt more like a court-martial than a technical discussion. "The flight test results are impressive," Chen began, consulting her tablet with the measured precision of someone who'd learned to separate personal opinion from professional evaluation. "All engine parameters remained within normal ranges throughout high-performance testing. From a purely technical standpoint, the repair work appears successful." The qualification hung in the air like jet exhaust, visible and toxic. Katia understood that technical success wouldn't protect her from the administrative consequences of authorizing unauthorized maintenance procedures. Military hierarchies demanded compliance with established protocols, regardless of whether those protocols produced optimal results. Rodriguez shifted in his chair, his uniform bearing the careful creases of someone who'd spent the morning preparing for vindication. "Ma'am, I want to emphasize that Lieutenant Commander Volkov proceeded without proper oversight despite my documented objections. The fact that the repairs held together doesn't validate the decision to use uncertified personnel." The accusation carried the weight of institutional authority. Rodriguez represented everything the Navy valued about maintenance protocols: documented procedures, certified technicians, supply chains that guaranteed compatibility and reliability. His objection to Walter's involvement reflected not personal animosity, but genuine commitment to systems that prevented disasters through regulatory compliance. Chen made additional notes, her stylus moving across the tablet's surface with mechanical precision. "Lieutenant Commander Volkov, can you explain your decision-making process regarding the use of civilian contractors for critical engine repairs?" The question forced Katia to confront choices that had seemed intuitive at the time, but looked increasingly reckless under official scrutiny. She'd authorized Walter's involvement based on nothing more substantial than confidence in his weathered hands, and the conviction that someone who'd spent 15 years maintaining base facilities might understand aircraft better than his janitorial uniform suggested. I evaluated available options and determined that Mr. Walter possessed relevant expertise, she replied, choosing words that sounded more definitive than her actual reasoning had been. The repair work was completed to specifications and tested according to established protocols. The explanation satisfied no one, least of all herself. Military leadership demanded better justification for decisions that circumvented established procedures, particularly when those decisions involved civilian personnel and unauthorized fabrication of critical components. But as Chen continued her questioning, Katia found herself thinking about Walter's steady hands and Mickey's precision manufacturing. Results mattered more than process, even in organizations built on procedural compliance. The investigation expanded like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each interview generating additional questions that required additional interviews. Lieutenant Commander Chen spoke with every mechanic who declared the Super Hornet irreparable, documented Rodriguez's objections in exhaustive detail, and submitted formal inquiries about Walter's background that disappeared into bureaucratic channels like intelligence reports filed with agencies that didn't officially exist. Walter himself remained invisible throughout the process, continuing his janitorial duties with the same methodical precision he'd shown while rebuilding impossible engine components. When investigators sought him for questioning, they found only an aging civilian contractor whose personnel file contained 15 years of punctual attendance and satisfactory performance evaluations. His technical expertise existed entirely outside official documentation, leaving no paper trail that could explain how someone paid to empty waste baskets had successfully completed repairs that defeated certified professionals. The mystery deepened when Mickey Chen's machine shop proved equally untraceable through normal channels. The business license existed, the address was legitimate, and the fabricated manifold met or exceeded all military specifications. But Mickey himself seemed to exist in the spaces between official records, his background a careful construction of minimal documentation and maximum capability. "It's like they're ghosts," Rodriguez complained during his third interview, his frustration evident in every gesture. "Nobody knows anything about their actual qualifications, but somehow they can rebuild turbofan engines using equipment that shouldn't exist." Chen nodded sympathetically while making notes that would eventually reach commands far above squadron level. The success of Walter's repair work had validated unauthorized procedures in ways that threatened the entire structure of military maintenance protocols. If civilian contractors could fabricate critical components using improvised methods, what did that say about the necessity of established supply chains and certified personnel? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating the kind of administrative puzzle that careers were built on solving, or destroyed by failing to solve. Chen understood that her handling of the investigation would be scrutinized by people whose names appeared on organizational charts she wasn't cleared to see. But in the hangar, the Super Hornet flew daily missions with engines that performed flawlessly, and Walter continued emptying waste baskets with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd kept another bird in the sky. The squadron briefing room felt smaller than usual, crowded with personnel whose presence transformed routine administrative matters into something approaching a formal hearing. Katia sat at the front table facing officers whose rank insignia represented decades of combined military experience, their expressions ranging from professional curiosity to barely concealed skepticism about her decision-making process. Captain Morrison, the squadron commander, occupied the center chair with the comfortable authority of someone who'd learned to balance institutional requirements against operational necessity. His silver hair and weathered features marked him as a pilot who'd transitioned from cockpit to command, without losing appreciation for the complexities that separated theoretical leadership from practical results. "Lieutenant Commander Volkov," Morrison began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd conducted similar proceedings before, Your unconventional approach to engine repair has generated considerable interest at levels well above squadron command. I'm told that certain agencies are very curious about the technical capabilities of civilian contractors operating in proximity to sensitive military assets. The phrasing suggested implications that extended far beyond maintenance protocols and personnel management. Katia realized that Walter's expertise had triggered security concerns that went beyond his ability to fabricate engine components using unauthorized methods. His knowledge of military aircraft systems, combined with his 15-year presence on a sensitive installation, had attracted attention from organizations whose involvement was never officially acknowledged. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, apparently realizing that his documentation of procedural violations had initiated investigations he'd never intended. His objections to Walter's involvement had been technical rather than security-related, focused on maintenance protocols rather than counterintelligence considerations. "Sir," Katia replied carefully, "Mr. Walter's assistance was limited to technical consultation and component fabrication. All work was performed under my direct supervision according to established safety protocols." The explanation felt inadequate even as she spoke it. Walter's knowledge of turbofan engine systems extended far beyond anything a civilian janitor should possess, and his connections to fabrication resources that operated outside normal supply chains raised questions about background and training that her investigation had never addressed. Morrison consulted papers that bore classification markings Katia couldn't read from across the room. "The security office has completed a preliminary review of Mr. Walter's background. I'm told the results are interesting." The pause carried weight that transformed the entire proceeding from administrative inquiry to something approaching a security briefing. Katia found herself wondering what kind of secrets Walter carried beneath his janitor's uniform, and whether her decision to trust him had exposed classified capabilities to unauthorized scrutiny. The truth, when Morrison finally revealed it, proved more remarkable than any security concern Katia had imagined. "Mr. Walter," Morrison announced, consulting classified documents with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that information security was more than procedural compliance, "is retired Chief Master Sergeant Walter Hayes, formerly of the 4th Fighter Wings Maintenance Squadron. His service record includes 3 tours in Southeast Asia, specialization in turbofan engine repair and modification, and classification levels that remain above your current clearance." The revelation hit Katia like wake turbulence from an unexpected aircraft. Walter wasn't an aging janitor with intuitive mechanical skills. He was a master craftsman whose expertise had been forged in combat zones where keeping aircraft flying meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. His 15 years of invisible service had been a kind of retirement in place, his technical knowledge preserved beneath the camouflage of civilian contractor uniforms and maintenance schedules. Rodriguez's expression shifted from vindication to something approaching awe. He'd spent the investigation documenting violations of procedures that Walter had helped write, criticizing technical decisions made by someone whose qualifications exceeded his own by decades of practical experience. "The security office," Morrison continued, "has also identified Mr. Chen's machine shop as a resource utilized by multiple military contractors for fabrication projects requiring discretionary handling. His work has supported operations that remain classified above your current level." The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft conducting normal operations. Katia realized that her desperate gamble on an old man's promise had connected her to networks of expertise and capability that operated entirely outside official channels. A shadow infrastructure of people who kept critical systems functioning when normal procedures proved inadequate. Walter's success hadn't just fixed her engines. It had demonstrated the existence of resources that military leadership preferred to keep invisible, even from officers who might someday need those resources to complete impossible missions. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. Lieutenant Commander Volkov, your decision to utilize Chief Hayes's expertise showed initiative that your superiors have noted favorably. However, future operations requiring similar resources will be coordinated through appropriate channels. The message was clear. Walter's help had been officially acknowledged and unofficially appreciated, but the networks he represented would remain carefully controlled and selectively accessible. As the briefing concluded, Katia understood that she'd been inducted into knowledge that would reshape her understanding of military capability and the relationship between regulation and results. The weeks that followed brought a gradual return to routine operations, but Katia found herself seeing the squadron's daily activities through transformed perspective. Walter continued his janitorial duties with the same methodical precision, but now she recognized the subtle signs that marked him as something more than his uniform suggested. The way younger mechanics instinctively deferred to his quiet suggestions, the careful attention he paid to aircraft that developed unusual problems, the network of informal consultation that kept him informed about maintenance challenges throughout the wing. Rodriguez had adapted to the revelation of Walter's background with the pragmatic flexibility that marked successful military careers. He'd quietly modified his approach to maintenance protocols, incorporating the understanding that some problems required solutions that existed outside established procedures. His stripes remained intact, and his reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by association with Walter's successful repair work. The Super Hornet continued flying daily missions with engines that performed flawlessly, each flight hour adding credibility to Mickey's fabricated manifold and Walter's unconventional diagnostic methods. The aircraft had become an unofficial test case for maintenance approaches that balanced regulatory compliance with operational necessity, demonstrating that the space between procedure and results could be navigated successfully when proper expertise was available. But the most significant change was in Katia's understanding of leadership and the responsibilities that accompanied command authority. She'd learned that effective decision-making sometimes required trusting people whose qualifications existed outside official documentation, and that the most valuable expertise often came disguised as something entirely different. Walter's knowledge represented decades of accumulated experience that couldn't be captured in technical manuals or training curricula. His ability to diagnose problems through intuition and solve them using improvised resources reflected skills that were developed through necessity rather than instruction. The kind of expertise that emerged from situations where failure meant something more significant than administrative inconvenience. As autumn progressed toward winter, Katia found herself watching for other Walter Hayes figures hidden throughout the base, people whose official roles obscured capabilities that might prove essential during moments when normal procedures proved inadequate. She'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that marked individuals whose expertise exceeded their apparent authority, and to appreciate the networks of informal knowledge that kept complex systems functioning despite bureaucratic limitations. The lesson had applications beyond aircraft maintenance. Military leadership required the ability to identify and utilize resources that existed outside formal organizational charts, to recognize expertise regardless of how it was packaged, and to make decisions based on capability rather than documentation. Walter had taught her that sometimes the most important qualifications were the ones that never appeared in personnel files. The change in squadron dynamics became evident during the winter maintenance cycle, when routine overhauls revealed problems that would have previously generated weeks of delay and procedural complications. Walter's presence had transformed the entire approach to difficult repairs, his quiet expertise serving as a resource that younger mechanics learned to access through carefully respectful consultation, rather than official work orders. Lieutenant Commander Chen incorporated Walter's diagnostic insights into formal maintenance documentation, creating a paper trail that legitimized his contributions without exposing the informal networks that made them possible. Her reports described technical solutions in language that satisfied regulatory requirements while preserving the operational flexibility that made those solutions effective. Rodriguez evolved from skeptic to advocate, his understanding of maintenance protocols enriched by appreciation for the expertise that operated beyond official certification. He'd learned to recognize situations where established procedures were insufficient, and to identify resources that could bridge the gap between regulatory compliance and practical necessity. The transformation represented more than individual adaptation. It reflected the squadron's growing sophistication in balancing institutional requirements against operational demands. Walter's success had demonstrated that the most effective military units were those that could access expertise regardless of its official packaging, and that leadership meant recognizing capability wherever it existed. Kadia's reputation within the wing reflected this evolution. Her willingness to trust Walter's expertise had marked her as someone who understood the difference between following procedures and achieving results, a distinction that proved increasingly valuable as she assumed greater command responsibilities. The lesson extended beyond maintenance protocols to fundamental questions about military effectiveness and institutional learning. Organizations that insisted on rigid adherence to established procedures might achieve consistency, but they often sacrificed the adaptability that distinguished truly successful units from those that merely met minimum standards. Walter's expertise represented accumulated knowledge that couldn't be replicated through training programs or technical documentation. His ability to solve impossible problems reflected decades of experience that had taught him when rules needed to be bent and how to bend them safely. That kind of wisdom was developed through necessity rather than instruction, and it was often found in people whose official roles provided no indication of their actual capabilities. As winter deepened, Katia realized that Walter's most important gift hadn't been engine repair expertise. It had been the demonstration that effective leadership required the courage to trust people whose qualifications existed outside official recognition, and the wisdom to recognize that the most valuable resources were often hidden in plain sight. The annual readiness assessment arrived with typical military precision, transforming routine operations into carefully orchestrated demonstrations of squadron capability. Aircraft gleamed under hangar lights, their maintenance records documenting performance that exceeded all established benchmarks. The Super Hornet that Walter had rebuilt occupied a place of honor in the lineup, its engines generating power curves that served as testimony to expertise that existed outside normal channels. Inspector General teams moved through the facility with clipboard efficiency, documenting compliance with regulations that had been written by people who'd never faced the practical challenges of keeping combat aircraft operational under impossible conditions. Their evaluation criteria focused on procedural adherence rather than operational results, measuring success through documentation quality rather than mission capability. Captain Morrison accompanied the inspection team, his presence ensuring that critical context wasn't lost in the translation between regulatory compliance and practical achievement. He'd learned to present Walter's contributions in language that satisfied institutional requirements while preserving the operational flexibility that made those contributions possible. Maintenance performance has exceeded expectations, Morrison reported.